So this morning we're absolutely delighted to welcome Vanda James from Birkett's law firm, and today we're going to be talking about the other considerations outside of your financial planning to which legal matters are really important, and in particular we're going to be focusing in this session on prenups and other legal considerations that couples can be considering when they're looking at their future planning. So welcome, Vanda. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Frankie. So I'm Vanda James. I'm head of Birkett's South East Family Law team. I've been a family lawyer for 30 years. I'm a trained collaborator and I'm a member of Resolution.
Amazing, and thank you so much for taking the time out to join us. So Vanda, often people, when they're thinking about prenups, are thinking of it as something that the super rich do or celebrities do. What do you see to be the kind of key benefits, and why might somebody want to consider putting something like that in place?
They're certainly not for celebrities only, and I think nowadays they're becoming ever more popular, probably because more and more people are choosing to build their careers and sort of build their assets before they get married.
Yeah.
And so I think that's been probably one of the main drivers for them becoming more and more popular.
Yeah. And do you, when somebody's kind of coming to thinking about having this conversation with their partner, do you have any kind of insights or tips as to how they might start to address those conversations?
Obviously, it can be a really sensitive topic and it can be a delicate conversation, but I always say to people, I think having an open and honest conversation early on is really important. And people often say, well, what should I say? Everybody's unique and people's relationships are very different. But I always suggest that people sort of speak to their partner and say, obviously we've got different levels of assets and I'd like to talk to you about something that I think is important for us as we plan and build our future together. It's about, I think, transparency and couples having conversations early on in their relationships, not just when they're thinking about getting married or entering into a civil partnership. I think finances can be a tricky issue, and couples have different expectations. People treat money differently. So I think it's part of that conversation, and I think it's really important for the person that's broaching the subject to assure their partner it's not about a lack of trust or that they're already anticipating that the relationship's going to fail. But I think it's more about just having some assurances that going forward they're clear about what might happen in relation to their assets if things were to go wrong. And I think the other important thing to remember is that the conversation might come out of the blue. Depends how open, how many conversations people have had about finances. And so I think if it has come out of the blue, then it's important to give your partner some time and space to actually think about it and process it. And they might need to go away and have a think about it because it can be emotional. So just give them time and then come back and restart the conversation.
And do you think that, if you are in a relationship where maybe you've just recently got married or you are married, what could individuals in that situation start to think about and be doing?
I think, so if you're already married, people marry at different times in their lives, and that's something else that we've seen with the requests for prenuptial agreements. So there's sort of two or three driving factors: people having careers and gathering their assets much earlier on, second and subsequent marriages and civil partnerships. So people having gone through a relationship breakdown, then quite often people say never again, but obviously I don't think we're designed to live on our own. So people do usually meet somebody else, and so it's then them not wanting to go through it again. And then the other really sort of significant driver, I think, has been where parents are passing money down to their children because it's really tough now for the next generation, the younger generation, to get onto the property ladder.
Yeah.
And so parents are having to pass, in some cases, quite significant capital down to their children.
Yeah.
And naturally, they want to make sure that
It's
if it goes
protected.
wrong, that it's protected.
Yeah. And can you talk to us a little bit about, the kind of the legal elements of it and how you would go about setting it up?
So prenups have been around for quite some time. They've gained momentum. They've not been legislated about, and so they're not legally binding. What that actually means is, because the government haven't really had enough time to incorporate them into legislation, and so what we found over recent years really is that the Supreme Court and the courts generally are having cases come before them, and so passing down judgments, which effectively now, if you enter into a prenuptial agreement, you've got to assume that it will be upheld, providing, of course, it meets all of the requirements of a prenuptial agreement.
Yeah. And so that's a really interesting point, because people often say, well, they're not legally binding, that it's not, they're not needing to be put in place. But actually, what we're seeing is that they're being used and
more and more,
more and
absolutely, and they're really quite, I find, in the area. I do a lot of financial work, and they are, and particularly now it's summertime.
Yeah.
Weddings coming up, and so
Yeah.
we get quite a sort of influx of new prenuptial work at this time of year. So the important thing to remember about a prenup is that you've got to make it as watertight as you can. It's got to be signed at least 28 days in advance of the wedding.
Okay.
And one of the main reasons is that you don't want undue pressure being put on somebody, because the build up to a wedding is quite stressful.
Yeah.
And couples need to be able to get on and plan that, and what they don't need is the stress of having to see lawyers and trying to get an agreement done. So I always say to couples, plan ahead as you would with your wedding. You don't book a wedding overnight. Sometimes weddings are 12 months, 18 months in the future. And I would say, if a prenuptial agreement is something that you're thinking about, have an early conversation with a lawyer and get it done sooner rather than later, so that it can be done and put away. Hopefully, it never has to be relied upon, but I think the sooner you get them done, the better.
The better. And when you're coming in, you've got individuals coming to you to have those conversations. What sort of assets are we talking about that form part of the agreement?
So it can be all sorts of assets. Quite often, people will have been passed money by a parent and they've bought their own flat or house. We see a lot of trusts, so wealthy families, as part of their tax planning, will put money into discretionary trusts. Children will often be beneficiaries of those trusts. And so they can really be quite valuable. And naturally, families will say, this is family money. It's not something that's been generated throughout the course of the relationship. And therefore, if the relationship goes wrong, we need to make sure that money's protected.
And then more recently, we've also been hearing about the kind of prenup, postnup. How many postnups are you doing, and is that really requirement for when straight after the marriage to kind of
postnups have two places, I think. Belt and braces would be to do a prenup, and then a postnuptial agreement, particularly if, and it does happen, rarely, hopefully, that you're within the 28 days before the wedding. And in those circumstances, we would always say to a client, it's within the 28-day window, and in order to ensure that it's not falling foul of the 28-day rule, have a post-nuptial agreement. And then the other side of it, the other circumstances we see quite often, is that people have married and can have been married months or actually even quite a few years.
Yeah.
And again, money comes into them that they've not necessarily generated themselves.
Yeah.
And so family money, inheritance, in those circumstances, couples then often say, actually, it's not been generated by our efforts and our daily endeavours.
Yeah.
And so let's have a post-nuptial agreement.
Yeah. And would you recommend, you know, even if it's not a route that somebody decides to take, that they talk to somebody like yourself just to get that conversation going?
I think finances in any relationship can sometimes cause tensions.
Yeah.
And I think just being clear about what it is that you want to achieve, having a chat with an experienced family lawyer is important.
Yeah.
I think it's really ideal, really, that there are some things that people like to do themselves.
Yeah.
And I'm always the first to say, listen, if you can do it yourselves, then do it. But there are some documents and some things that people just really shouldn't do themselves.
Yeah.
And a prenuptial agreement is one of them.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be costly.
Yeah.
But when you think about it, what you're trying to protect is probably your whole estate.
Yeah.
And to get it right in the early stages, rather than if the relationship goes wrong and you end up separating, it's a lot more expensive.
Yeah.
Trying to deal with it at the other end.
Yeah. I often get asked when talking about prenups, what are the primary financial benefits of somebody setting one up?
I think the primary benefit is obviously asset protection. When individuals have built a career and accumulated a variety of assets and they're coming into a new relationship and perhaps their new partner isn't quite in the same financial position, the other thing that they can protect are debts and liabilities, and they can shield one party from the other party's debts.
Okay.
People don't often know that aspect about prenuptial agreements, and actually the beauty of them is that they are bespoke and they are tailored to individual circumstances. So one size doesn't fit all. And that's why it's really important to know your client, sit down and have a really good chat with them and actually find out what sort of conversations they've had with their partner about finances and whether they're both on the same page or not.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point around, you know, often you're thinking about it from an asset preservation, but protecting yourself against someone else's debts is just as important.
Yeah.
And then also, you know, sometimes people have concerns or reservations about if they were, you know, a spotlight was shone on them and scrutiny was placed, how well they would stand up because they're not, you know, fully legally binding. What would you say to somebody that maybe takes that view when considering a prenup?
So although they're not enshrined in law, providing that all of the requirements are met when you enter into a prenuptial agreement. So the requirements are that they are signed at least 28 days in advance of the wedding, that both parties take independent legal advice, that there's no undue pressure for them to sign the agreement, and also that there's been full and frank disclosure of one another's circumstances. So there's got to be transparency, because as a solicitor, when advising a client whether to enter into a prenuptial agreement, you have to know what there is and what potentially, particularly if your client is not the wealth creator, what it is that they may be giving up in terms of their rights and claims if the relationship were to subsequently break down.
Yeah.
So it's really important that all of those elements are met to make it as strong as it possibly can, and to give maximum weight to it.
Yeah. Brilliant. Perfect. Thank you.